Let's start with Arab American artists as a standalone category. What are some of the unique perspectives and experiences these artists bring to their work, and how has that evolved over time?
Great, thank you, Oscar, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, indeed, coming from Dubai. I was just in Venice for the opening, and so I'm very happy to share in terms of my expertise. Obviously, Yasmina has already mentioned a few very key artists that are well known in terms of modern and contemporary in the works that we offer in our sales. And so I'll delve a bit deeper into why choosing some of these artists that I'll share today, and of course the multi-layers and where they're from, where they studied. So we could start, I broke it into between modern and then contemporary. Modern, mainly within the mid-20th century, are well known. Many, when governments had different scholarships to study abroad, many artists went to Rome, they went to London, and many also went to New York, California. So these key artists, just to show you as examples, Etel Adnan, that was just mentioned, who also just had this Google Doodle that was for her, is probably one of the most well-known in our sales, who traverses between European, but also most importantly in the US of her time being in Berkeley, and through her writings and of course through her works that we'll get into. Huguette Caland as well, within her works. She was also living in California. And then you have Saliba Douaihi, Lebanese American, who came in the 1950s, was actually asked to help renovate a church in Brooklyn, stained glass, and then I'll get into as well some key other works. Kamal Boulata, Palestinian artist, who spent almost 25 years also living in the US, DC area. And Helen Khal, who actually, while coming from Lebanese family, only ended up going to Lebanon in her 20s, was in Allentown, Pennsylvania, was part of Painting in the Art Student League, and then ultimately opened up Gallery One later with her then husband in Lebanon. So if you go to the next, just to show off other key artists in the contemporary. Of course, when we mention contemporary, artists that are living today, and just now are getting picked up by key galleries that we'll also speak about. Michael Rakowitz from New York, Iraqi artists. Then you have also Farah Al-Qasimi, Emirati artist who is between, she graduated in Yale and then is also between UAE and US. Diane Al-Hadid, who is from Aleppo originally, but is also based in New York. And then you have Haif Kahraman, artist from Iraq who has lived most of her time now in LA. Jordan Nasser, also Palestinian, actually Palestinian Polish origins, and Walid Rad. So this is really to show you, key layers within their works, just basically in their backgrounds of where they're from.
So, Suzy, can you talk a little bit about the themes that these artists are always exploring in their work?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. The Venice Biennale exhibition is titled "We Are Foreigners Everywhere," and it's really talking a lot about obviously migration, displacement, exile, but also celebrating key traditions. Most importantly, combining based on their environment that they're looking at. And even if you look at modern, for instance, the basis of what modern Arab art was created was many of these artists that studied abroad. Looking at Saliba Douaihi, and I'll show examples later, who is inspired by painting Lebanese landscapes, but also within a color field, Rothko, Clifford Still, based on obviously with who he was meeting with. So I think those are key elements in terms of landscapes of the region, but also hitting migration as well.
Thank you. Helen, you belong to the first generation of Arab American artists who spent an important chunk of their lives in the Arab region. And then you later moved, you moved to the US. How did your personal experience affect your art? And how did you use your art as a platform to tell stories and connect cultures, particularly with the rich narratives of Arab American heritage?
Yeah, thank you. Tak Minds, thank you very much, Ricardo. Karam, thank you. I'm so honored to be here, and we're going to keep within our time and not be Arab about it. As was mentioned, I was born in Beirut. My father is originally from Damascus, the old city, and I grew up mostly in Lebanon, Iraq, Kuwait, Baghdad, I just mentioned that. And then finally came to America to study, left finally from the Civil War. We were evacuated in Lebanon in 1975. And when we left, I asked my father, who had to stay there, I asked my father, when are we going to come back? And he said, you will be back in 1 week. And that week was, for me, 35 years. And so we left to Athens. I finished my schooling in Paris. Finally, the time came back for me to go do a big show at Ajiab in Hamra with Saleh Barakat. And this was the first time in 35 years I'm going back home. And I had to create new work for the show. This is the first piece I did. This is called Bait. I call it Circle Home. And Suzy and our first speaker were talking about these themes in Arab art. And as a contemporary Arab American artist, I am talking about identity, movement. Where is it that we call home, you know? So I've never done anything like this before. It was painful to do, actually. My hand cramped up. And in the middle of it, and I couldn't make a mistake, I started in the middle with the word bait that I wrote over and over and over again. And the pain that I felt in my hand, I thought, well, this is bringing back a lot of painful memories for me. Good ones, but anyways, this is the first piece that I did for that show, Circle Home Bait. And you see a detail here because, and also, I didn't want my kitty cats to jump on my drawing board, and they would. And if they did, I would have to start all over again. We were talking about bringing our identity to America and this bridging dialogue, which I think this whole program is about, bridging dialogue and creating these conversations that I hope today we want you guys to take away from our panel. I live in Washington, D.C. We had 9/11, of course. And as an artist, as an Arab American, I faced a lot of backlash. Of course, we had that in the media, on TV, the stereotyping. I was invited the very first week to be part of a prominent touring exhibition with Rauschenberg, Gilliam, Faith Ringgold, who she just died as well, but Liechtenstein. And when the curator called me up to invite me, it was the Friday, 9/11 was Tuesday, it was Friday, and I had already had several unpleasant things happen to me, including being spit on. So I said, her name is Nancy, I said, Nancy, do you realize I'm an Arab American? And she said, I do. I said, do you still want me in the exhibit? And she said, I do. And so we've had this amazing sort of like side of acceptance and so on and so forth. This is this piece now. It's called Prayer Rug for America. You see my motifs, you see my little shoes down there. I'm asking for a place to come in to have a place of introspection instead of divisiveness. And this one now is at the Library of Congress. This piece, and I'm not going to take all this time, I promise. So when I went back to Beirut and Syria and Jordan, I came back to America, and within a couple of months, the quote-unquote Arab Spring began. And you know, as an artist, I think what we do, we don't create the problems, but we talk about them in our work visually, about what's going on around us. So in the beginning, and I'm not being political at all, in the beginning, we were thinking about hope and optimism with revolutions and possible change and so on and so forth. So this is the first piece I did, called Arab Spring, with the use of this flower motif as a sign of optimism that I've kept up. Now, 13 years later, I'm still working on this larger body of work, talking about tradition and what you asked in stories. And my work is all about stories. I could keep you here forever and ever. My father is the Hekawati in our family, the storyteller. And he's the patriarch, 97, knock on wood. Thank you. Thank you. And so we grew up with his stories. And he immigrated to America in 1946. And there are a series of 25 stories. I just picked a couple here. Good, you can see it well. This is called The Birth of a Child. And so when my dad told the story, first of all, it's an oral tradition. And I was invited to do an exhibit, and I asked him to write them down. And he just looked at me and said, no. And he turned around and left. My nice mom, American mom's like, go back to your studio. I'll try and talk with your father, and I'll call you back. So I went back to my studio, and my dad is super stubborn. And they called me back, and my dad had agreed, but he said he didn't like it. These are private. No one's going to be interested in them. These are private family stories for our family. Okay. I had a big exhibition. We had 14 of them, the stories. And this all came after sort of 9/11, telling our own stories, recreating that narrative that we were talking about, changing the narrative, telling our stories. And my dad didn't say one word to me. He didn't say, I'm proud, nothing. But the next day he came to my studio and he said, here are 2 more stories. And that was it. This one here, the birth of a baby in a village in Syria or Lebanon. You see the midwife there. And the woman, my dad told me she can stay in her bed for 40 days. And there would never be a kitty cat there. I snuck my cat in there. I put the husband, he would never be there too, but I put the husband smoking hubbly bubbly. He's relaxing, let's face it. And then the baby has hijab, Daddy told me, is pinned on the baby. And in the hijab, it has either a saying from the Bible, of course, because there are many Christian Arabs, or a saying from the Quran. And Daddy also told me that this little hijab can be kept as the child gets older and pin it inside and keep the evil away from him. And the tradition of mughli, when you have a baby come, so that they would offer it to everybody trooping in there, bringing germs to the babies, I guess. And Daddy, when he came here, he did the same tradition for his grandchildren. He made it for everybody and the guests to celebrate the birth of the baby. And then the snaniya, which you make when the child received, his first tooth, indicating the child can crunch or is getting older. Daddy repeated these stories, bringing these. And this is coming to America, jumped through many of them. This is when Daddy comes to America on a ship called Volcania. And they stayed up, this is from Lebanon, Port of Lebanon. And this ship was confiscated by the Americans from the Italians. And that ship sailed into the harbor. And my dad, as a young man, stayed up with all the other young people on the boat because they wanted to be the first ones to see the Lady Liberty. And when Daddy told the story, he said he remembered it was a clear day. I just really love that. And now we're going to go to Suzy.
So thank you. By the way, the Mughli story.
The Mughli, yeah.
At one time, I told my mom, why do we have to wait for people to have babies to have Mughli?
True.
I have Mughli all the time. So she started doing it every day for me.
No, that's really good.
Anyway, so
like
Suzy, as someone deeply involved in the commercial and academic aspects of art, how do you see the market for Arab American artists and artists from the Middle East? Let's make sure we understand the distinction. How do you see those evolving? And what can be done to promote Arab American art and art from the Middle East on a global scale?
Sure. So I would be happy to give you an intro as to working 7 years now at Christie's Auction House, a global house that we sell, many different categories. I'm a specialist of 20th, 21st century Middle Eastern art. Artists, of course, tracing their roots within the region, but that are living in the diaspora. A few key artists that I mentioned earlier are those that you'd see many a times popping up in our sales across auctions and private sales. And so Christie's has historically been one of the first major auction houses to have a presence in the region within 2005, 2006 in Dubai. And then actually just the first year and first month that I started back in 2017 was the first time then we started to expand it to London, which really pointed already to an expansion of key clients, both across institutions and private collectors that were looking to invest. So it's only been an upwards trajectory for where the state of the art market is. To give you in terms of some key figures, the highest work of art yet of an artist from across the Middle East is Parviz Tanavoli at 2.8 million US, back I believe it was 2008. And then Mahmoud Saeed, an Arab artist, is at 2.5 million US dollars. It's a beautiful whirling dervishes piece. So I'm quite active in strategically placing works across our international sales, and also will be speaking further on works in other auctions. You want to just...
Suzy, Mahmoud Saeed is Egyptian, right?
Yes, Egyptian, but was well within, coming from Alexandria, most of the key artists were there, and then traveled throughout the Mediterranean between Paris, exhibited at Venice actually in the 30s and 40s, and was part of the first Egyptian surrealist groups within the 20s. Yeah.
So Helen, next question is for you. How do you navigate the balance between art as an expression of cultural identity and art as a commodity in a global market? What challenges do you face in trying to achieve both things at the same time?
Right. Well, it's interesting here. This is the macro level, and I'm a micro level as an Arab American contemporary artist. And I'm really excited if I can pay my rent. So obviously I'm not up there yet, but I think that I measure my success and I am validated by some of the collections I'm in, Bargil, Library of Congress, World Bank, many private collections, Arab American National Museum. But I think there are other ways of being acknowledged as an Arab American artist. So I am not so worried about my art being a commodity for sale. Because I think if I start thinking that way, I'm not going to be authentic. I'm not going to tell the stories that I feel need to be told, So I get my validation in other ways money is good, but I feel like there are other ways to be validated as an artist. Education, like we talked about. Sarah, you mentioned that I was resident at the Kennedy Center, am a resident at the Kennedy Center, social impact. This is a huge deal. And so me, as an Arab American, gets to go in there and exhibit. It's not a private gallery. It's where the whole world converges for opera. Of course, you've all been there. And so I was invited to exhibit my Syrian migration series. And this is, I have 52 in this series. And this was inspired by Jacob Lawrence, the great African-American artist who painted the migration series from 1940 to 1941 of the movement of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North for a better life. So they were fleeing segregation, Jim Crow, a violence of another sort. And I was invited for a residency. I was limited by what I could do in the studio. So I kept seeing these parallels between his panels, there are 60 of them, and what was happening with the Syrian war, which was a result of the quote-unquote Arab Spring, which I began documenting it. So I have a timeline of the events leading up until present. And this was one of the first pieces I did in Jacob Lawrence's. He has St. Louis, Chicago, New York, I believe they're all moving towards. And here, of course, I have where a bulk of them. At the beginning, when I started painting, it was like 2015, and we had about 13 million displaced Syrians moving, crossing borders. Of course, here is another one with the crossing in the Mediterranean that is happening today. This series of work garnered me a lot of attention because I was telling the story of what was going on in a way that was palatable. I'm not hitting you over the head. I'm not showing you gruesome pictures, you know. I've been on a panel with a German photographer who, very graphic about the Syrian refugees, children. I couldn't even look. And at some point in the panel, he said, if anyone knows how I can exhibit these, let me know. No one wants to exhibit them. And it was like I kept it back there thinking, okay, he wants to get across a message, but how is he going to get it across if no one can even look? So I do it in my way. And I'm probably entering into another question. This is at the Kennedy Center, the Hall of Nations. And I was really envisioning people crossing the borders. And I myself, when we were breaking curfew and going from Lebanon, we had to leave very quickly. We left everything. And my two younger sisters, one of my sisters, we were chasing after my father and my mother, breaking curfew. We hadn't been out in a really long time. And my sister lost her shoe. And I thought, oh my gosh, we're going to get in trouble with my father if we don't, you know, I don't know. I don't know what happened to that shoe. But if you think about it, shoes are symbolic for two reasons. Run away from danger, run towards your dreams. And so that's why I use shoes. I started painting all these little kids' shoes. This is called The Places They'll Go. I'm taking off on Dr. Seuss, oh, the places you'll go. For all your dreams ahead of you, I'm asking you to rethink what a lot of people are going through. Okay, then we'll and I probably answered all the questions that she has to finish. But you asked me how do I perceive that my work is being successful, is telling messages, right? This is little Amal. This, I don't know if you've heard of her. I know she came to Boston, right? So I was invited by the artistic director he was inspired by my paintings to create a scenario for little Amal. And she began as a 10-year-old little Syrian refugee, traveling across. She met the Pope. She went all over the world. And she came to Union Station, and she came, and you know, it's a train station. It was like a pop-up event, very choreographed, but a pop-up event. And you could hear a pin drop. They didn't know what was going on, but they got it from her being the whole scenario that she created. She's so huge, she had to be carried in like that into the train station. Anyways, these are some acknowledgments that I feel are important in terms of my career. Okay.
Suzy, what does it take for an artist to become successful and gain global recognition today?
Sure. Maybe if you want to just go back to the slides with the price, just for me to kind of go through a bit further what it really means. It's always a key question that people ask, both in terms of artists and then collectors asking what artists to look at. I will share with you also, just based on what we do in placing works in auctions, both in the Middle East and then globally. So if you just go to the slide before. So these all have key, and as you mentioned, Hakawati.
Yeah.
I identify as a Hakawati, a storyteller. Each and every single one of these works comes with a very unique story. I decided to show these key pieces on these slides to indicate both connections to the US, coming from Arab artists, both modern as well as contemporary. On the top left, you have Jawad Salim. This is extremely rare to find works of Jawad. And what's very interesting is the fact, and I realize Helen and I have a connection also with a key family, the Parker family, and how this all connects. This work, The Watermelon Cellar in 1950s, actually was when Jawad was traveling. There was a 50s exhibition, Iraqi painter, and they traveled all throughout the region. He's known as the father of modern Iraqi art, the Freedom Monuments that's sitting in central Baghdad, that you see many graduation pictures and many that take pictures nowadays. He basically had interpreted what it meant to be a modern Iraqi artist, founded the Baghdad Modern Art School in 1951, just when he was touring. So this was a key record that did quite well in our London sale, the first I was working on. Samia Halabi, I'm sure many of us are familiar with, a Palestinian artist, lived most of her life out of New York. This is the record for the artist at around $500,000 US. And this is a wave that she had and dreamed of as a kid. 1970s works for her are extremely, extremely sought after and rare. We sold just recently work in a Dalul collection sale coming from the same period that actually the Eden Khal just underneath it was as well, coming from the Dalul collection. Etel Adnan is someone that you will see many a times popping up into our international sales. And Nibil Nahas, actually his pumice works use pumice stone that kind of look like sea life coral reef. He was inspired to use it by walking on the beaches in the Hamptons and saw after a hurricane a lot of starfish that were washed up. Haif Kahraman actually was collaborating on UAE fashion book, and this is one of her records for her works on paper that we sold in our Dubai sale last year. And if you want to just, so this slide is very important because this is a major part of what I, firstly as an American, someone who is passionate in studying in the region, is finding areas where we can place these works into the international sales. When an artist in markets wise, when an artist is placed into the post-war contemporary sales next to the Jacob Lawrence or the Basquiat or the Warhols, this is kind of in a way of when you recognize that they've made it in the market sense, where you see artists like Etel, which I placed this work into the New York sale next to a Basquiat of Valentino's collection, and it did quite well on these pieces. You get Calon, this came from Eric Clapton's collection. This was in a day sale in London from her body part paintings when she was in Paris. Ahmed Matar, who is a Saudi artist who I've had the pleasure of working on a joint US-Saudi exhibition that ended up traveling to San Francisco, Houston, and also Maine, Aspen. So this is his well-known magnetism works. And Sriba Duwehi, this one is quite special. It's very rare, part of now the Barjeel collection of Sultan Saud al-Qasimi. This came from the Rockefeller family at a time when Duwehi was there in the 50s, living on top of a small corner of a church in Brooklyn. And so you mentioned, Oscar, in terms of what it takes for an artist to find themselves, and as Ellen was mentioning, it's not necessarily that every successful artist translates into auction records, because actually some artists, are doing installation works, mixed media, performance that you can't really translate it. And so, it's very important, firstly, to find maybe a gallerist or key advisor. Working on artist statements is also very important because then it really helps, because at the end of it, understanding who your audience is as important. So many of these artists that I mentioned, in the first two slides are represented by galleries or participating in residencies abroad, which is also very important. I was just in the Bali Foundation in Lugano, who has now had a residency for a Saudi American dancer performer, who you wouldn't probably necessarily see her works in auctions, as well as being represented by key residencies and foundations. Yeah, so this is really showing what Christie's is doing on a level that's also educational, academic. By being a specialist in a region, you really have to. It's because at this point there's only 2 catalog raisonnés, now 3, of artists from the region. So it's very important in terms of archiving and documenting. And so I think that's different aspects to really address.
Yeah, and you talked about education and cultural exchange programs too with the State Department. And that is a very important way also too of having that exchange. And Art and Embassies program, I don't know, this is, we're in John F. Kennedy's town. So he began this program in 1960s as an arm of visual diplomacy. and it was during the Cold War, and I think the first exchange was Dave Brubeck, who went over and the Russians started tapping their feet, you know, to Dave Brubeck's music. So already you've created this little movement of acceptance and understanding. And so State Department Art and Embassies program, which I've been part of in different places, is really crucial with you with Fulbright as well. So, yeah.
Well, we always were speaking, there's the Parker family in 2021. We sold a collection of American family who is stationed living in Baghdad. David Parker and Rita Parker, they were a family that was living out there with the American Friends of the Middle East, who actually then, American Friends of the Middle East turned into Ahmadis, which then sold that Jawad Salim work that I shared. And the beauty is the archives that the wife Rita had saved actually helped document so many of these. We're just in a position, especially at Christie's, if we don't have archival material or illustrated material, it's very difficult for us to put in. But if we do put in the auction at that level, then it turns into key masterpiece works.
I'm going to get off the subject for 1 second and ask you, have the families of these artists been helpful in archiving the materials if the artist became more famous after his death? Like, how
it's
difficult
always a
has that
fine
been?
line, and it's an important point because all of these modern artists, and I always mention, actually right now as we're speaking, I mean, it's in Abu Dhabi, NYU Abu Dhabi, there's a key platform, a Mawrid Center in NYU. They're doing a massive conference, having many international scholars speaking about archiving, because realistically, every modern artist should have a scholar doing their doctorate on these works. Every single artist should have a catalog raisonné. The fact that there is only 3 at the moment is very difficult, because when you have a catalog raisonné, you understand the supply of works, why you would invest in a work at a top level, whether it's 50, 100,000, up to 1 million. Right now, Mahmoud Said is an example. There is a catalog raisonné. There was previous archival work that was done, so it was a bit easier for the two, Dr. Hussam Rashwan and Valérie Didier, who's actually a colleague of mine who's in Paris, who just finished Abdelhadi Al-Ghazar raisonné as well. It's a fine line because some families, it's very extensive when you're doing a catalog raisonné because you're saving not only paintings, but it's scrap paper, writings, everything. So for you to have a comprehensive oeuvre, study of their entire oeuvre. So it's difficult, I will say. There's some key estates that do have, but it's always a case where you have collaborations with different universities.
Helen, can you share an instant where you felt your work significantly contributed to a broader dialogue or brought about a change in societal perceptions, where you thought you made kind of an impact on someone?
Yeah, I mean, I've touched on it. I think this definitely was an important time. I go back to the Kennedy Center where I gave talks, I gave workshops, but I think people who would never go, as I said, into a private gallery, walking in that space, you're able to share so much about who you are as what story you are trying to tell. And this one was specifically around women and refugees, women and children refugees. And it was also at the time of Ukraine so people looking at my paintings there in the Hall of Nations were identifying with Ukraine, that, you know, they could see the similarities and talking about the basic humanity of what's going on. I answered.
I think you answered the question here. Suzy, the last question is for you. Looking at the future, how do you see the landscape of Arab American art and culture evolving? And what steps can be taken to ensure the richness of the landscape is both preserved and innovated for future generations?
You know, now you can go in different museums. I'm in the Metropolitan Museum, and I'm seeing a Ghazar painting that we had sold, you know, next to key other modernists. I think over time, there's going to be many different curatorial changes to how exhibitions are structured, rewriting the narrative, as we were always discussing. And this is especially where a key team like the Middle East, the same way Latin American, Southeast Asian, African, are part of this, where we're rewriting the narrative, and we're just, being able, from a very archival aspect even as well. I mean, I just went to Nigerian Pavilion, Christie's had helped sponsor. Their pavilion is mainly all about archives and documentation to really share, just even on a simple biographical background. This is exactly someone like Sultan Sotoqasmi had always mentioned, of just having the normal dates of the artists, where they studied. Writing in archives is as important, because in order, this translates into the material in exhibition catalogs, which then is used for auction catalogs, which then helps people who are investing, who are collecting works, to be there. So I'm very hopeful, and especially living in the Gulf region, it's coming at a time where there's been massive support, both in terms of residencies, universities that are happening. And so, by working at a place like Christie's, we're extremely active in collaborating with different foundations, giving proceeds towards, we helped with catalog raisonnés of different artists, offering different Christie's education courses. And so now more than ever, a big portion also as to why being here right now is to focus on building these bridges, which is going to be happening in
One last question, which is not part of this talk, but it came up. Let's talk a little bit about women artists in the Middle East right now, which is, I have collected a lot of young Saudi female artists that are unbelievable. There seems to be a rise in both, especially women, in the Middle East right now, a resurgence. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, the women are in major stakeholders in key cultural institutions, museums, curators. I mean, you mentioned with Saudi, Manal Dawayan, who is representing Saudi in the pavilion, is probably one of the most, if you do end up going, is probably one of the most chilling, striking walkthroughs of an exhibition, really recounting her narrative of being a woman. She was, had this whole I Am Anna series where it's after women drove, but really showing the legacy and the importance that women have had. Then you had also Dana Awatani, another younger Saudi Palestinian artist. So they are major, changing and ripples and effects that are happening in the region. Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
We're going to do a quick Q&A.
Oh.
Yeah, just very quickly.
Any questions?
All right, friends, we're going to take 2 questions. We'll have one for Suzy and one for Helen from the crowd, and we will have someone bring a microphone to you. So go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question to one of our panelists.
Hi. So my question is, how can a young Arab artist develop in a way where they can reach the international media for art and development, especially if they're not pursuing art as a degree, perhaps, but something else?
I think now is more than ever a time. I almost question the role. I mean, the galleries have to, in a way, change their model, because with social media and the ability to really develop your identity and your art practice online is also very interesting, because that's actually how many gallerists are trying to find artists. If you really develop, it's like your brand statement is also very important, and really integrating this, and going to different events also is very important. Key university exhibitions, it's quite important. But I'm very hopeful. It's that moment where you could really develop, a very sweet in terms of, the website. Maybe also, Helen, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a slow building process. You don't just get there. It's these little pieces, little mosaic pieces that work together, and one thing moves on top of the other, and you just keep at it. And if you have something to say that's authentic, we want to hear it, but do it well.
I would say from a collector's point of view, there's thousands and thousands of artists around the world, right? So how do you sift through all that? Nobody can do it except galleries, basically. So what happens is, why do you go to galleries? Because galleries have looked at hundreds of them and have decided that we're going to pick those 20 that we want to work with. And then that's where I go. And then from there, the museums end up picking that up as well. They see the work at the gallery. And then you have different levels of galleries. You have the galleries kind of who take you in because you're new. And then you have the other ones where you graduate into the bigger ones later on. And then that's where your price starts becoming and your demand becomes much higher. So that's kind of the process. But you have to go through the system. There's a lot of artists who think they can do it on their own. It doesn't work because then nobody picks up on your work except friends of a few people, and it can only take you so far.
My question is addressed to Suzy. Now, I very much agree with what Helen says about being really validated with the success in private collections and exposure, pretty much, and actually transmitting the message that the artist wants to transmit.
Right.
But my question comes from my attorney curiosity. So how does Christie's actually protect the rights of the families of the artists that you sell the art of? And now, of course, having an archive is incredibly important, but do you also have records of the future of the arts you sell?
Yes, so the first part, it's extremely important that as an auction house, we have close relationships with these estates. Most importantly also, especially it's for modern, there's a lot of fakes that circulate, and the authenticity of it is as important, and also as well as due diligence. I mean, some artists like Paul Gergosian, as an example, Manuela and her foundation, they have more archives that when you share with them a work, and they also appreciate it because then they understand it adds further. Some are hidden masterpiece works that they had no idea about, and then they end up having all of these different archives. Manuela, for instance, has a whole inventory of key exhibitions. She might have images of the works, and if the images of the works are in, a palace that's, I remember, it was in Aleppo or Damascus for work that we sold, it helps because it adds further value for the work. You develop key relationships. Clients now more than ever, at a time, even when I first started till now, certificates of authenticity, provenance documentation are extremely important. If you don't have that, then it's we're not going to take a risk to put it at sale. It's something very, very important for us. So yes, key relationships with these estates are very important, and areas where we can help link different scholars so that further research can be done is there, and there's key publications that we really consult very most importantly. And you mentioned also the second follow-up question, so in terms of the future, we have an extensive network of clients, both in terms of trade, who are advisors, dealers, institutions, museums. We always want to know where it's going, and for me, it's always, to see the backgrounds of many of these collectors, where they're coming from, their backgrounds. Some are from the region, some are not, but we have, it's a small enough category in terms of where we focus on with Middle Eastern art that we can be able to know most of the clients. You might have people bidding on a work that maybe is, the work could go high above, but you have 2 to 3 bidders, whereas some of these big auctions that are in New York, London have 5, 10, really depends. But yeah, we do.
But you'll be surprised. For example, I get a lot of my work has been in museums, but I don't advertise it. But what happens is because of the tracking they do, both galleries and museums work together because when they want to have a retrospective of an artist, they have to find who the people are that bought these pieces. So they end up contacting you and asking you if you would be willing to lend the piece to the museum. So that's how it works. A lot of people think that you make money off of it. No, you don't. You're just doing it as a service, basically, to help the public, better understand the history of the artist. That was one part of your question. The other part I was going to say, I think she mentioned what happens, does the family still make money as you resell the same painting all, over and over again? The answer historically has been no, but there is a trend now where I have been in situations where I have sold a painting that I bought where I had to give 10% to the artist. But it's not happening across the board, but there's a little bit of it going on, especially when the artist was, his prices went from like $0 to $1 million in no time. it's kind of unfair for them to be still struggling when their art is so valuable.
Yes, I mean, certificates of authenticity, depending on, you know, how the archives had extent of it, are paid, and we would do that. Sometimes depends if Christie's will or the client, but yes, it's as important. And most museums, institutions, because of our relationships, will also approach us. We speak to collectors in terms of loaning different works. We're speaking right now with Huguette Calonne is going to have a great retrospective in the Reina Sofia next year, so we're speaking to a few clients on that. So yes, it's, yeah, thank you.